August 13, 1940. Shortly after dawn, nearly 1,500 German aircraft began climbing through broken cloud over the Pas de Calais. Bombers, fighters, dive bombers. The largest air attack in European history up to that point. The Luftwaffe called it Adlertag, Eagle Day, the day they would destroy the Royal Air Force forever. The formations crossed the Channel at altitudes ranging from 10 to 20,000 feet. Navigators confirmed headings. Targets included airfields across southern England. Luftwaffe intelligence had promised the British would not see them coming. Intelligence had promised the RAF was nearly finished. Intelligence had promised the skies over England belonged to Germany now. 20 minutes before the first bombers reached the English coast, Spitfires from Fighter Command were already climbing to intercept. They knew the altitude. They knew the heading. They knew the number of aircraft in the formation. They were waiting at exactly the right position, at exactly the right time, with exactly enough fuel and ammunition to engage. The German pilots never understood how. None of them did. Every single time they crossed the Channel, the British were waiting. Not sometimes. Every time. They flew at dawn. The British were there. They flew at dusk. The British were there. They changed altitudes. They changed routes. They changed formations. It made no difference. The RAF always knew they were coming. German pilots returned to their bases in northern France and reported the same impossible situation to their commanders. We have surprise on our side. We outnumber them 3-1. But every time we cross the coast, their fighters are already in position. How do they know? Adolf Galland, who would rise to command Jägerschwader 26 during the battle and who was already one of the finest fighter pilots Germany ever produced, voiced what every German aviator was thinking. During these battles, he wrote, the RAF seemed to know just where and when to send their aircraft. This made him suspect a high level of organization was at work controlling RAF fighters. He was right, but he did not know the half of it. The commanders had no answer. Luftwaffe intelligence had no answer. Hermann Göring, the supreme commander of the German Air Force, had no answer. For the entire summer of 1940, Germany threw everything it had at Britain, over 2,500 aircraft, the most powerful air force the world had ever assembled, and it could not solve this single mystery. How did the RAF always know? The answer was hidden in plain sight. It stood 110 meters tall. It was bolted to the cliff tops of southern England, in a chain of steel and wooden towers that stretched from the Orkney Islands to the Isle of Wight. The Germans flew past these towers every single day. They photographed them, they studied them, they even sent a spy airship to investigate them, and they still could not understand what they were looking at. This is the story of how a Scottish meteorologist, a stubborn air marshal nobody liked, and a 4'11" radar operator saved Britain from invasion, defeated the most powerful air force on Earth, and never received the recognition they deserved. It begins with a death ray. In January 1935, the British Air Ministry was terrified. Adolf Hitler had openly begun rearming Germany in violation of the Treaty of Versailles. The Luftwaffe was growing at an alarming rate. German bomber production was accelerating. British air defences were almost non-existent. The country had no reliable method to detect incoming bombers until they were already overhead, and by then it was too late. A single squadron of bombers could flatten a city block before a single fighter could scramble from the ground. Harry Wimperis was the Air Ministry's Director of Scientific Research. He was desperate for solutions. He had established a new body called the Committee for the Scientific Survey of Air Defence, chaired by Sir Henry Tizard, a former RAF pilot-turned-chemist who was then rector of Imperial College London. The committee's job was simple: find a way to detect enemy bombers before they reached Britain. Find it fast. Wimperis wrote a letter to a meteorologist named Robert Watson Watt, asking a question that would change the course of the 20th century. Could radio waves be used to build a death ray? Could electromagnetic energy disable a pilot in flight or destroy an aircraft engine from the ground? Watson Watt was 42 years old. He was born in Brechin, a small town in Angus, Scotland, on April 13, 1892. He was, by family tradition, a descendant of James Watt, the man who had transformed the steam engine and helped launch the Industrial Revolution. Robert Watson Watt had not transformed anything yet. He studied at University College Dundee, which was then part of the University of St Andrews, taught physics there briefly, and then spent the next 20 years working for the meteorological office. His specialty was tracking thunderstorms by the radio interference they generated. He used cathode ray tubes to display the electromagnetic noise that lightning produced, and triangulated the position of distant storms so pilots could be warned to avoid them. It was unglamorous work. Nobody outside the weather service knew his name. But those 20 years had given him three things that would prove invaluable: a deep familiarity with cathode ray tubes as display devices, an instinct for radio direction finding, and a practical mentality that prioritized working systems over theoretical perfection. When Wimperis's letter arrived, Watson Watt passed the death ray question to his assistant, Arnold Wilkins. Wilkins ran the calculations overnight. His answer was definitive. A death ray was physically impossible. The amount of electromagnetic energy required to incapacitate a human being through the metal skin of an aircraft at any operationally useful range was beyond anything technology could produce. It could not be done. But Wilkins added a second paragraph that changed everything. He had noticed that post office engineers, working near the BBC's shortwave transmitter at Daventry, had reported strange interference whenever aircraft flew overhead. The radio signal flickered. Wilkins suggested that if radio waves could not kill, perhaps they could detect. Perhaps you could send out a pulse of radio energy, have it bounce off an aircraft, and measure the time the echo took to return. From that measurement, you would know the aircraft was there. You would know its distance. You would know its direction. Watson Watt recognized the significance immediately. He did not hesitate. He did not convene a committee. He did not file for a research grant. He sat down and wrote. On February 12, 1935, he sent a memo to the Air Ministry. He titled it, Detection and Location of Aircraft by Radio Methods. In it, he wrote that attention is being turned to the still difficult but less unpromising problem of radio detection. That memo has been called the birth certificate of radar. Tizard read the memo and demanded a demonstration. Not a theoretical paper, not a committee discussion, a working demonstration. He gave Watson Watt 2 weeks. On February 26, 1935, Watson Watt, Wilkins, and an Air Ministry observer named A.P. Rowe drove a converted Morris ambulance to a field in the parish of Stow Nine Churches in Northamptonshire, a few miles south of the BBC's shortwave transmitter at Daventry. They set up 2 simple dipole receiving antennas connected to a cathode ray oscilloscope on the back seat of the van. A Handley Page Hayford bomber from RAF Farnborough flew a prearranged oval pattern at 6,000 feet, passing repeatedly through the BBC's radio beam. Each time the bomber crossed the beam, the green trace on the oscilloscope deflected. A clear, unmistakable jump. Watson Watt watched it. Wilkins watched it. Rowe watched it. The aircraft was 8 miles away. They could see it on the screen as clearly as if someone had drawn an arrow pointing at it in the sky. Watson Watt did not build a death ray. He built something far more dangerous. He built an early warning system, and he built it in a single afternoon using a borrowed radio signal and equipment that cost almost nothing. The 3 men stood in that field and knew what they had just witnessed. Rowe filed his report that evening. In it, he confirmed that Watson Watt's theory was sound and that a practical detection system could be built. The green trace had jumped. Physics worked. The question was no longer whether Britain could detect incoming aircraft. The question was whether it could build a network fast enough to matter. Tizard reported the results to the Air Ministry immediately. Funding was approved within weeks. Watson Watt's small team moved to Orfordness on the Suffolk coast and began building a proper transmitting and receiving station. Progress was rapid. By June 1935, they could detect aircraft at 17 miles. By July, the range had stretched to 90 miles. In 1936, they relocated to Bawdsey Manor on the Suffolk coast, a grand Victorian estate overlooking the North Sea, where Watson Watt became superintendent. Watson Watt had a philosophy that would define everything that followed. He later described his approach as a conscious cult of the imperfect. His motto became legendary within the British scientific establishment. Give them the third best to go on with. The second best comes too late. The best never comes. He refused to wait for perfect technology. He built radar using long wavelength radio waves, 10 to 13 meters, operating at frequencies of around 22 to 30 megahertz. This was technically cruder than what the Germans were already developing at shorter wavelengths, but it worked now. It could be deployed this year, not next year, not in 5 years. Now. That decision, engineering for speed instead of perfection, may be the single most consequential technical choice of the entire war. The system was given the deliberately misleading name RDF, Radio Direction Finding, chosen specifically to make it sound like an existing, harmless technology. The word radar, an American acronym for radio detection and ranging, was not adopted in Britain until 1943. By September 1938, during the Munich crisis, 5 chain home stations covering the approaches to London were operational 24 hours a day. By the outbreak of war in September 1939, exactly 21 chain home stations stood along Britain's eastern and southern coasts. Massive steel transmitter towers rose 360 feet into the air. Wooden receiver towers stood 240 feet tall. The transmitters pumped out enormous pulses of radio energy, up to 750 kilowatts of peak power. The receivers picked up the faint echoes bouncing back from aircraft up to 120 miles away. At 15,000 feet, Chain Home could detect bomber formations assembling over their bases in France before they even turned toward the Channel. But radar alone was not enough. A radar screen showing a blob of light meant nothing if nobody could translate that blob into a squadron of Spitfires arriving at the right place, at the right altitude, at the right moment. Radar was just a sensor. A pair of eyes. What Britain needed was a brain to process what the eyes were seeing, and hands to act on what the brain decided. That brain and those hands were built by a man nobody liked. Air Chief Marshal Hugh Caswall, Tremenhere Dowding, was born on April 24, 1882, in Moffat, Scotland. He was the son of a schoolmaster. He was educated at Winchester College and the Royal Military Academy at Woolwich. He was commissioned into the Royal Garrison Artillery and served in Gibraltar, Ceylon, Hong Kong and India, before learning to fly at Brooklands in 1913 with just 2 hours of instruction, paid for on credit. In the First World War, he commanded squadrons on the Western Front. He was a champion skier. He was also an introvert, socially graceless, blunt to the point of rudeness, completely uninterested in political maneuvering, and incapable of the easy charm that career advancement in the RAF demanded. His men called him stuffy. He never objected. Dowding had one quality that mattered more than personality. He understood systems. From 1930, he served as Air Member for Research and Development, and later as Air Member for Supply and Research on the Air Council. In those roles, he made 2 decisions that would determine the fate of his country. First, he insisted on the 8-gun monoplane fighter specification that produced both the Hawker Hurricane and the Supermarine Spitfire. Those 2 aircraft would fight the Battle of Britain. Second, he backed Watson Watt's radar program without hesitation from 1935 onward, fighting the Air Ministry bureaucracy at every step to secure funding and support. He also demanded bulletproof windscreens for his fighters. When the Air Ministry resisted on grounds of cost and weight, Dowding reportedly said, "If Chicago gangsters can have bulletproof glass in their cars, I cannot see any reason why my pilots cannot have the same." He got the windscreens. On July 14, 1936, Dowding became the first air officer commanding-in-chief of the newly formed RAF Fighter Command, headquartered at Bentley Priory, a Georgian mansion in Stanmore, northwest London. He was due to retire in June 1939. The Air Ministry kept extending his service because nobody else could do the job, and nobody else understood the system he was building. Over the next 4 years, Dowding built something unprecedented in the history of warfare. He created the world's first integrated air defense network. It would eventually carry his name. The Dowding System connected every component of Britain's air defense into a single, coherent machine. But before the system was tested, Dowding had to fight a different battle. In May 1940, France was collapsing under the German Blitzkrieg. Churchill, newly appointed as Prime Minister, was committing hurricane squadron after hurricane squadron to a losing cause, sending precious fighters across the Channel to support the French army as it crumbled. Dowding watched his strength bleed away. On May 16, 1940, he wrote a letter to the Under-Secretary of State for Air that may be the most important single page in British military history. He wrote that the last estimate made by the Air Council as to the force necessary to defend the country was 52 squadrons, and that his strength had been reduced to the equivalent of 36 squadrons. He requested that when a minimum level of strength was reached, not one fighter would be sent across the channel, however urgent and insistent the appeals for help may be. He concluded that if the Home Defence Force was drained away in desperate attempts to remedy the situation in France, defeat in France would involve the final, complete, and irremediable defeat of this country. The letter worked. By June, only 3 Hurricane squadrons remained in France. The rest came home. Dowding had saved his force for the battle that actually mattered. At the base were the sensors, 21 chain-home radar stations along the coast, a growing number of chain-home low stations that could detect aircraft flying as low as 500 feet, out to 30 miles. Over 1,000 observer corps posts, manned by more than 30,000 civilian volunteers who tracked aircraft visually and by sound once they crossed inland beyond radar coverage, coastal command patrol sightings, and occasionally decrypted German signals from Bletchley Park. All of this information flowed to one place, the filter room at Bentley Priory. This was the brain of the entire system. Originally set up in the ballroom of the mansion, it was moved into a purpose-built underground bunker in March 1940, 4 months before the battle began. Women of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force stood around an enormous map table wearing telephone headsets. They pushed coloured counters across the map using long croupier-style wooden sticks called T-sticks, each counter representing a radar contact or an observer report. Filterers standing nearby assigned each track a raid number, X for unidentified, F for friendly, confirmed by an electronic identification system called IFF, identification friend, or foe, H for hostile. Tellers on a raised gallery above the table spoke the consolidated air picture by direct telephone line to the operations rooms of Fighter Command and the 4 group headquarters. From the filter room, the picture flowed outward to the groups, 10 group covering the southwest under Air Vice Marshal Brand, 11 group covering the southeast and London under Air Vice Marshal Keith Park, a New Zealander who had fought at Gallipoli and the Somme before becoming a pilot. 12 group covering the Midlands and Eastern England under Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory, 13 group covering the North under Air Vice Marshal Richard Saul. Each group headquarters had its own plotting table replicating the Bentley Priory picture for its area and a large illuminated board called the tote board that showed the status of every squadron. At readiness, available. Ordered to scramble, airborne, in position, enemy sighted, engaged, returning, refueling. Coloured lights shifted as reports came in. The controllers could see the entire battle at a single glance. Below the groups were the sector stations, the fighter airfields where squadrons actually launched: Biggin Hill, Kenley, Hornchurch, Tangmere, North Weald, North Holt, Debden. Sector controllers, the men who actually put fighters onto enemy formations, spoke directly to airborne pilots by radio. They gave vectors, compass headings to fly. They gave angels, altitude in thousands of feet. They said bandits to describe enemy aircraft and gave estimated strength. A pilot could take off knowing absolutely nothing about the tactical situation and within minutes be guided to a precise interception point with accuracy that seemed almost supernatural to the enemy. The Germans could not understand it because they had never built anything like it. Germany had radar. In fact, German radar was technically superior to British radar. The Freya system operated at a wavelength of 2.4 meters and gave cleaner, sharper returns than chain home. The Würzburg system was even more advanced, operating at 53 centimeters with extraordinary precision for anti-aircraft fire control. But the Germans used their radar sets in isolation. Each station reported to its local command. There was no central filter room, no integrated picture, no single commander watching the entire battle and directing every squadron simultaneously in real time. Dowding had built the equivalent of a modern air traffic control and battle management system decades before the technology was supposed to exist, and he ran it all from a country house in the London suburbs. If you want to know how this system performed when the Luftwaffe threw everything it had at Britain, please like this video. Every like pushes this story to someone who has never heard of Hugh Dowding, Robert Watson Watt, or the women who sat in that filter room and saved their country while the world forgot their names. They deserve to be heard. Please subscribe. Now, back to the story. Before the battle began, Germany had one final chance to discover Britain's secret. They sent a spy airship. In May and again in early August 1939, General Wolfgang Martini, Chief of Signal Affairs of the Luftwaffe and head of its Signals Intelligence Branch, packed the gondola of the LZ-130, the Graf Zeppelin II, Germany's last operational airship, with high-frequency radio receivers. He flew it up the east coast of England at low altitude. Martini was aboard himself on the first mission. He suspected the chain of enormous towers appearing along Britain's coastline was an air search radar network. He needed proof. His technicians listened on every frequency their equipment covered, scanning the electromagnetic spectrum for radar transmissions. They heard nothing but loud, crackling static on every band. The mission returned to Germany with no evidence of British radar. The failure was catastrophic, and it was entirely self-inflicted. 2 mistakes killed the mission. First, Martini's team assumed any serious modern radar would operate at short wavelengths, in the VHF or UHF range, the way German systems like Freya and Würzburg did. Chainhome operated at much longer wavelengths, around 10 to 13 meters, frequencies that German radio engineers considered primitive and unsuitable for serious air detection. The technicians were hearing chainhome transmissions the entire time. They dismissed them as meaningless atmospheric noise because they could not believe the British would deploy a system so technically unsophisticated. Second, Martini had brought his own broadband radio transmitter aboard the airship for meteorological observations. It was pumping out powerful electromagnetic interference that swamped the very receivers his technicians were desperately trying to use. A crewman named Breuning later wrote that he repeatedly asked Martini to stop transmitting so they could listen properly. Martini refused. Meanwhile, the British were watching every move the airship made. Chainhome tracked the Graf Zeppelin II from the moment it appeared on the coast. The operators at Bordsey followed it with precision. The airship flew directly over Hull. The Germans aboard, using their own navigation equipment, calculated their position and placed themselves 20 miles offshore over open water. The British radar showed them directly over the city. An RAF officer at Fighter Command Headquarters later admitted they were sorely tempted to radio a correction message to the airship, but doing so would have revealed that Britain was actually tracking the airship's position by radar, so they stayed silent and let the Germans remain lost. The opening round of the electronic air war had been fought and lost by Germany before a single bomb fell on British soil, and the Germans did not even know it had happened. The situation grew worse because of one man. Oberst Josef Schmid, known universally as Beppo, was the chief of Luftwaffe intelligence. He was a close personal friend of Goering. He was also a man who told his superiors exactly what they wanted to hear, regardless of the evidence. In July 1940, as the air campaign against Britain was being planned, Schmid produced 2 intelligence assessments that shaped the entire German strategy. Both were catastrophic failures of analysis. Schmid's reports claimed British fighter production was running between 180 and 300 aircraft per month. The actual figure was approximately 500 fighters per month during the summer of 1940, more than double his highest estimate. He claimed the Messerschmitt 110 twin-engine fighter was considered a match for the Spitfire. It was decisively inferior in every aspect of air combat. He claimed British fighter squadrons were inflexibly tied to particular bases and could not redeploy. This was completely false. He claimed the British air defence system was adequate only to defend London. It defended the entire country from the Shetland Islands to Land's End. And in neither assessment, not in a single paragraph, not in a single footnote, did Schmid mention chain-home radar or the existence of any kind of integrated fighter control network. The most important military technology in Britain, the system that would decide the outcome of the entire battle, simply did not appear in German intelligence reports. Göring read Schmid's reports, nodded with satisfaction, and confidently told Hitler that the RAF could be destroyed in 2 to 4 weeks. The Battle of Britain began on July 10, 1940, with the Kanalkampf, the Channel Battle. German aircraft attacked shipping convoys in the English Channel and probed British coastal defences. Even in this early phase, German pilots noticed something unsettling. Every convoy attack was met by fighters that appeared to have been waiting for them. Galland noted in his diary on August 11 that during these early engagements, the RAF seemed to know exactly where and when to send their aircraft. He began to suspect that some sophisticated system of organisation was controlling the British fighters. He was correct. but his suspicion never reached the intelligence officers who could have acted on it. On August 12, 1940, the Luftwaffe finally attacked the radar stations directly. A specialized fighter bomber unit, Erprobungsgruppe 210, flying Messerschmitt 110 fighter bombers under Hauptmann Walter Rubensdorfer, struck the chain home stations at Dover, Rye, Pevensey, and Dunkirk at 0720 hours. 3 stations went off the air for several hours. The attacks were precise. Bombs cratered the grounds around the towers, severed power cables, and damaged receiver huts. That same morning, 15 Junkers 88s of Kampfgeschwader 51 attacked the Ventnor radar station on the Isle of Wight. 4 250-kilogram bombs destroyed the transmitter block. Ventnor went off the air completely. It would remain silent for nearly 2 weeks. RAF mobile radar units rushed to the area to provide partial coverage, but the gap in the chain was real. For the first time, the Dowding System had holes in its vision. If the Luftwaffe had continued attacking radar stations systematically, targeting the same stations repeatedly until they were permanently destroyed, Chainholme could have been crippled. The entire air defense network depended on those towers. Without them, Dowding was blind. But the attacks would soon stop, and they would stop because of one man's impatience. On August 15, 1940, the Luftwaffe launched its largest attack of the entire battle, over 1,700 sorties. Formations attacked from Norway, Denmark, and northern France simultaneously. It was also the day Luftflotte 5, attacking the northeast coast from Scandinavia, was detected at extreme range by chain home stations and intercepted by supposedly resting squadrons of 13 Group. Luftflotte 5 suffered such heavy losses that it played virtually no further part in the battle. 3 days later, on August 18, 1940, the Luftwaffe struck even harder. The date became known as the hardest day, the single bloodiest day of the entire Battle of Britain for both sides. RAF. Losses reached 68 aircraft. The Luftwaffe lost 69. Stukas from Sturzkampfgeschwader 77 screamed down on the Poling radar station on the south coast of England. Inside the concrete receiver block at Poling, a 20-year-old WAAF corporal named Avis Joan Hearn was sitting at her cathode ray tube, watching the green trace for radar returns. Hearn was 4 feet 11 inches tall. Before the war, she had been an upholsterer from Amersham in Buckinghamshire. Now she was one of the invisible women who kept the Dowding System alive. The first bombs hit the station. The walls cracked, windows blew inward, showering the room with glass. Debris fell from the ceiling. The building shuddered with each explosion. Hearn did not move. She stayed at her screen, reading radar returns, calling out plots, passing information to Bentley Priory through her headset while the building shook around her. She told her controller, "The course of the enemy bombers is only too apparent to me because the bombs are almost dropping on my head." About 30 aircraft dropped approximately 90 bombs on Poling that day. Hearn kept transmitting through the entire attack until the station finally went silent. She was awarded the Military Medal, one of only 6 given to a woman of the WAAF during the entire war. King George VI presented it to her personally at Buckingham Palace in March 1941. The very next day, on August 19, Goering held a commander's conference at his country estate, Carrinhall. He reviewed bomb damage assessments from the radar attacks. Most of the stations had been repaired within hours. Temporary mobile units had filled the gaps. Even Ventnor's coverage was partially restored by a mobile reserve unit. Goering reached a conclusion that would decide the fate of nations. He issued an order. It is doubtful whether there is any point in continuing the attacks on radar sites, in view of the fact that not one of those attacked so far has been put out of action. That single sentence was the most consequential strategic error of the Battle of Britain. Goering did not understand what he was looking at. He thought radar stations were isolated pieces of equipment, radio towers that could be replaced by a truck with an antenna. He did not understand that they were the eyes of an interconnected system. Without radar, Dowding could not see the enemy forming up over France. Without that early warning, the RAF would have to fly exhausting standing patrols along the entire south coast, burning fuel, wearing out engines, and spreading fighters so thin that the Luftwaffe would overwhelm them within days. Goering ordered his pilots to stop attacking the towers and concentrate on destroying airfields instead. The eyes of Britain's defence remained open. While the Luftwaffe was failing to blind the Dowding System from the air, another war was being fought in complete secrecy, a war of invisible beams that most people have never heard of. In the spring of 1940, a 28-year-old physicist named Reginald Victor Jones was working for Air Intelligence, seconded from the Royal Aircraft Establishment. Jones was born on September 29, 1911, in Herne Hill, London. He had studied at Wadham College, Oxford, and completed his doctorate at the Clarendon Laboratory. He had a brilliant, obsessive mind that thrived on puzzles. He collected fragments of intelligence the way other men collected stamps, piecing together patterns from scraps that nobody else noticed. From a captured German airman's papers, Jones found a handwritten note that read, "Radio beacon Knickerbein from 0600 hours on 315 degrees." From the wreckage of crashed Heinkel 111 bombers, British technical intelligence discovered that their Lorenz blind landing receivers were vastly more sensitive than any known landing system required. The equipment could receive signals from hundreds of miles away. Why would a landing system need that kind of range? From a bugged conversation at the Combined Services Detailed Interrogation Center, where captured aircrews were secretly recorded, Jones heard a German pilot boast of some secret navigation system. "They will never find it," the pilot said. Jones assembled these fragments into a terrifying conclusion. The Germans were using intersecting radio beams transmitted from stations on the European continent to guide their bombers to targets in Britain at night with extraordinary precision. The system was called Knickerbein, meaning crooked leg. A bomber flew along one narrow radio beam until it intersected a second beam transmitted from a different station. The intersection point was the target. Release bombs. The pilot did not need to see the ground. He did not even need a navigator. The beams did everything. On June 21, 1940, Jones briefed the War Cabinet personally. He was 28 years old, standing before the most powerful men in Britain. Winston Churchill listened without interrupting for 20 minutes. That same night, Flight Lieutenant Hal Bufton and Corporal Mackey, flying an Avro Anson trainer out of RAF Boscombe Down, searched for the beams at the frequencies Jones had calculated. They found them. Exactly where Jones predicted. The beams intersected directly over the Rolls-Royce aero engine factory at Derby. The implications were staggering. If those beams guided German bombers to the Rolls-Royce works, Britain would lose the factory that manufactured Merlin engines. The Merlin powered both the Spitfire and the Hurricane. No engines meant no fighters. No fighters meant no air defense. No air defense meant invasion. Robert Cockburn's countermeasure unit at the Telecommunications Research Establishment built jammers within days. They transmitted false signals called aspirin that mimicked the dash component of the Knickerbein beam. German pilots flying along what they believed was the correct course were actually being nudged off target. They corrected their heading in the wrong direction. Their bombs fell in empty fields and pastures miles from any target of value. The British also constructed devices called beacons that received German radio navigation beacons and rebroadcast them from transmitters positioned in England, pulling entire bomber formations dozens of miles off course. Jones defeated Knickerbein. Then the Germans deployed its successor, the more sophisticated X-Gerät, used by a specialized Pathfinder unit called Kampfgruppe 100. Jones found it and broke it. Then the Germans deployed the even more advanced Y-Gerät. Jones found that too and defeated it within weeks. Each time Germany developed a new navigation system, Jones identified it, understood it, and neutralized it. The British countermeasures were so effective that German bombers routinely dropped their payloads miles from their intended targets without ever realizing they had been deceived. While Jones fought the invisible war of beams and jammers, the visible battle over southern England reached its crisis. From August 24 to September 6, 1940, the Luftwaffe hammered 11 groups' sector stations with relentless daily attacks. Biggin Hill, Kenley, Hornchurch, North Weald, Debden, Croydon. These were the nerve centres of the Dowding System in the southeast. Destroy the sector stations and you destroyed the controllers who directed the fighters. Without controllers, pilots were flying blind, even with radar working perfectly. Biggin Hill alone was hit 6 times in 3 days. On August 30, 39 ground personnel were killed in a single raid. The operations room was knocked out of action. Temporary control facilities were established in a village shop nearby. Across 11 Group, exhaustion was setting in. Experienced pilots were being killed faster than replacements could be trained. Park later admitted the RAF was within 2 weeks of breaking point. The system was bending under the strain. One more sustained push against the airfields might have shattered it. Then Adolf Hitler made the second catastrophic German mistake of the battle. On the night of August 24, 1940, a German bomber crew, either lost or having overshot their assigned target, dropped bombs on central London. It was almost certainly unintentional. The Luftwaffe had been under strict orders to avoid the British capital. Churchill did not care whether it was deliberate. He ordered Bomber Command to attack Berlin the following night. 95 bombers were dispatched. 81 reached the German capital. The material damage was minimal. The psychological impact was enormous. Hitler was enraged. On September 4, 1940, at the Berlin Sportpalast, he screamed to a roaring crowd that he would erase British cities, that he would put the night pirates out of business. On September 7, 1940, 348 German bombers, escorted by over 600 fighters, turned away from the sector airfields and attacked London instead. Goering travelled to the White Cliffs at Cap Blanc-Nez on the Pas de Calais to watch his formations cross the Channel. He broadcast to the German nation that he had personally assumed leadership of the attack and called it an historic hour in which the German Luftwaffe had struck at the heart of the enemy. The Blitz had begun. London burned. The docks along the Thames were an inferno visible for 50 miles. Civilians died in their hundreds. Entire neighbourhoods were flattened. Families huddled in underground stations, in Anderson shelters in their gardens, in cellars beneath their homes. London would be bombed on 56 of the following 57 nights. More than 43,000 civilians would die in the Blitz across Britain. The human cost was beyond comprehension. But the strategic effect was the precise opposite of what Germany intended. Goering had made a fatal error. By turning his bombers away from the airfields, he gave Fighter Command the one thing it desperately needed: time. Every hour the Luftwaffe spent bombing London was an hour the sector stations were not being attacked. The operations rooms at Biggin Hill were repaired. Ground crews patched cratered runways overnight. Damaged aircraft were recovered and rebuilt. New pilots arrived from operational training units. The radar chain, unmolested now that Goering had abandoned the tower attacks, recovered to full strength. The Dowding System, which Park privately admitted had been days from breaking under the sustained assault on the airfields, was given the breathing room it needed to survive and fight on. Keith Park, the New Zealander who commanded 11 Group and who had watched his airfields being systematically destroyed for 2 weeks, understood what had happened immediately. He said simply, "The enemy lost the Battle of Britain when he switched from bombing my fighter stations to bombing London." 8 days later came the day that decided everything. September 15, 1940. It would become known as Battle of Britain Day. Overnight, Bletchley Park decrypted German signals, indicating a maximum effort raid the following morning. Park knew what was coming. He briefed his ground crews to turn aircraft around in record time. Rearm. Refuel. Get them back in the air. Every minute counted. The first massive German formation crossed the coast late in the morning. Chainholm tracked it from the moment it assembled over the Pas de Calais. The filter room at Bentley Priory plotted the raid. The tellers called it through to 11 Group. Park scrambled his squadrons in carefully timed waves, feeding them into the fight one after another rather than launching everything at once. It was exactly the dispersed interception tactic he and Dowding had always advocated. That afternoon, Winston Churchill arrived at Park's underground operations room at RAF Uxbridge. The bunker was 60 feet below ground, reached by 76 steps. Churchill sat in the gallery above the plotting table and watched the battle unfold. Coloured counters moved across the map as WAAF plotters tracked every raid and every squadron. On the wall, the tote board showed the status of every fighter unit in 11 Group. One by one, the squadron state lights turned red. Engaged, engaged, engaged. Every single squadron in 11 Group was committed. Churchill watched the last light go red and turned to Park. He asked the question that has echoed through 80 years of history. What other reserves have we? Park gave a 3-word answer. There are none. Every fighter Park had was in the air, fighting. If the Germans had sent a third wave that afternoon, there would have been no one left to meet it. The cupboard was bare. Britain's survival hung on whether the Luftwaffe had anything left to throw. They did not. The Germans had no idea how thin the British margin was. They could not see Park's tote board. They did not know every squadron was committed. Because Schmid's intelligence was wrong about everything. Because Martini's airship mission had found nothing. Because Goering had stopped attacking the radar stations. Because nobody on the German side understood the system they were fighting against. The Luftwaffe lost 56 aircraft on September 15. The RAF lost 28. The ratio was 2-1. The Luftwaffe had thrown 2 massive raids at London, and both had been met by what appeared to be the entire strength of fighter command. German bomber crews reported facing wave after wave of British fighters arriving from every direction, precisely coordinated, arriving at exactly the right altitude. RAF pilots recalled being vectored straight onto the incoming formations by their sector controllers, placed in the perfect position to attack from advantage. The Dowding system was working exactly as designed. The German High Command was stunned. Schmid's intelligence had promised the RAF was down to its last 100 fighters. Instead, it seemed stronger than ever. How was this possible? The answer was simple. Schmid was wrong. British fighter production had replaced every loss. The Dowding system had made every fighter count by placing it where it could do the most damage. The RAF was not dying, it was winning. 2 days later, on September 17, 1940, Hitler postponed Operation Sea Lion, the planned invasion of Britain, indefinitely. The postponement became permanent. The invasion never happened. Britain would not be conquered. The war would continue. 5 weeks earlier, on August 20, 1940, Churchill had stood in the House of Commons and delivered the words that would define the battle forever. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. He was talking about the pilots, the young men in Spitfires and Hurricanes, but he could have been talking about Watson Watt and his cathode ray tubes, about Dowding and his filter room, about the WAAF plotters pushing counters across a map table, about Avis Hearn at Poling, 4 feet 11 inches tall, calling out plots while bombs rained down on her building, about R.V. Jones, 28 years old, explaining invisible beams to the War Cabinet, about 30,000 Observer Corps volunteers standing in fields with binoculars, reporting what they saw by telephone. All of them were the few. None of them flew. All of them fought. The RAF kept its secret protected with one of the most audacious cover stories in military history, Carrots. In November 1940, as the battle shifted permanently to night raids, Britain deployed its first airborne interception radar in Bristol Beaufighter night fighters. On the night of November 19-20, 1940, Flight Lieutenant John Cunningham of 604 Squadron, guided by his radar operator Sergeant John Phillipson, shot down a Junkers 88 over southern England. It was the first successful airborne radar kill in history. Cunningham would finish the war with 20 victories, 19 of them at night. The Ministry of Information needed a cover story. They planted press articles claiming Cunningham ate extraordinary quantities of carrots, which gave him superhuman night vision. The nickname Cat's Eyes Cunningham was born. The Ministry of Food piled on enthusiastically with wartime posters, recipes for carrot jam and carrot pudding, and a cartoon character called Carroty George. Newspapers in Britain and America ran breathless stories about the miracle vegetable. The idea that carrots improve your eyesight persists to this day. It was never true. It was propaganda designed to hide the existence of airborne radar. The Battle of Britain was won. The German invasion was cancelled. Britain survived. The men and women who built the system that made victory possible should have been celebrated as the greatest heroes of the war. They were not. Instead, the British establishment turned on the people who had saved it. On November 24, 1940, barely 4 weeks after the battle ended, Hugh Dowding was removed from command of Fighter Command. The man who had built the entire integrated air defence system, who had fought the Air Ministry to keep fighters in Britain when Churchill wanted to send them all to France, who had won the only strategically decisive air battle in history, was relieved of his command and effectively forced into retirement. The reason was politics, pure and simple. Air Vice Marshal Trafford Lee Mallory of 12 Group and his protégé squadron leader Douglas Bader had argued throughout the battle for assembling large wings of 3 to 5 squadrons before engaging the enemy. They called it the big wing tactic. Dowding and Park insisted that the radar warning time available over southeast England was too short for such formations to assemble. Small, fast, precisely directed interceptions were more effective. Post-war analysis would prove Dowding and Park correct, but the big wing lobby had powerful political allies. At a meeting at the Air Ministry on October 17, 1940, Dowding was ambushed. Bader was present, invited without Dowding's knowledge. Sholto Douglas chaired the meeting in place of the ailing Chief of the Air Staff, Sir Cyril Newall. The meeting had been arranged to humiliate Dowding in front of his subordinates. It succeeded. 5 weeks later, Dowding was gone. Park was removed from 11 Group on December 18, 1940, replaced by the very man who had intrigued against him, Lee Mallory. Air Vice Marshal Donald Bennett, who later commanded the RAF Pathfinder Force, wrote about Dowding's removal in his 1958 memoir. Bennett had visited Dowding after the war and was appalled by what had been done to the man who saved Britain. He wrote that petty jealousies amongst senior Air Force officers were unhappily all too frequent, and that on this occasion such jealousies were responsible for one of the most deplorable examples of lack of appreciation for a great Englishman ever displayed. Dowding was sent to the United States on a procurement lecture tour. He hated it. He retired from the RAF in July 1942. He was raised to the peerage as Baron Dowding of Bentley Priory in 1943, but he was never given the rank of Marshal of the Royal Air Force, the honour that should have followed the greatest defensive victory in British military history. In retirement, Dowding withdrew into spiritualism and theosophy. He wrote a book called Lightgate in 1945, in which he described his belief that he was in communication with the spirits of dead RAF pilots. He wrote that when men have been suddenly killed in the heat of action, they have no idea that they are dead and wander about for a time in a state of great bewilderment, and that these were the people he was enabled to help by quietly explaining their condition to them. The man who saved Britain spent his final decades trying to save the ghosts of the young pilots who died under his command. He called them his dear fighter boys. His own son, Derek, had flown fighters during the battle. Dowding carried that weight until February 15, 1970, when he died at the age of 87. Keith Park received similar treatment. After his removal from 11 Group, he was sent to Training Command, then Egypt, then Malta, in July 1942, where he applied exactly the dispersed interception tactics that had won the Battle of Britain and saved that besieged island as well. Lord Tedder later said of Park, "If ever any one man won the Battle of Britain, he did." I do not believe it is realised how much that one man, with his leadership, his calm judgment, and his skill, did to save not only this country but the world. Park retired to New Zealand. A permanent bronze statue was unveiled in Waterloo Place, London, on September 15, 2010. Watson Watt received a knighthood in 1942. In 1952, the Royal Commission on Awards to Inventors granted him £50,000 for his initiation of radar. Many felt the sum was insultingly small for the man whose invention had saved the nation. He emigrated to Canada and later moved to the United States. In 1956, Watson Watt was driving through Ontario when a Canadian police officer pulled him over for exceeding the speed limit. The officer had clocked him using a radar gun. The inventor of radar had been caught by his own creation. Watson Watt reportedly told the officer, "Had I known what you were going to do with it, I would never have invented it." He later wrote a short comic poem about the incident titled A Rough Justice. He died on December 5, 1973, in Inverness. There is one final detail that brings this story full circle. After the war, Robert Watson Watt and Wolfgang Martini, the German general whose failed Zeppelin mission had missed Chain home entirely, became close personal friends. Watson Watt wrote, "I have a very dear post-war friend in General Wolfgang Martini, a shy, modest, charming, and very perfect gentleman. His many claims on my affectionate respect include his failure to endear himself to Goering. The two men who had fought the opening round of the electronic air war, one who succeeded and one who failed, spent their remaining years in warm companionship. Martini advised the post-war West German military and NATO on signals before his death on January 6, 1963. Adolf Galland, the ace who had sensed from the very first weeks of combat that something was profoundly wrong with German intelligence about the British defences, survived the war. He was captured by the Americans, held for 2 years, and interrogated extensively about Luftwaffe operations. When asked about the Battle of Britain, Galland was blunt about where blame belonged. The intelligence service under Schmid, he said, had never properly assessed the British defensive system. Galland later befriended several of the British pilots he had fought against, including Douglas Bader and Robert Stanford Tuck. When Goering had demanded to know what the fighter arm needed during the darkest days of the battle, Galland had given his famous reply, "I should like an outfit of Spitfires for my Geschwader." He did not believe the Spitfire was a better aircraft than the Messerschmitt 109. He meant that the close escort role Goering was forcing on his fighters, chaining them to the slow bomber formations, negated every tactical advantage the 109 possessed. Galland died in 1996, never having forgotten those summer skies where the RAF was always waiting. Beppo Schmid, the intelligence chief whose reports had omitted radar entirely and underestimated British fighter production by more than half, was promoted to General Lieutenant in 1944. He commanded Operation Bodenplatte, the failed surprise attack on Allied airfields on New Year's Day, 1945. He died in 1956, having never publicly acknowledged the intelligence failures that helped cost Germany the Battle of Britain. The official dates of the Battle of Britain are July 10 to October 31, 1940. Over that period, the Luftwaffe lost approximately 1,700 aircraft destroyed and over 600 damaged. RAF, Fighter Command, lost just over 1,000 aircraft. 544 Fighter Command aircrew gave their lives. Those numbers tell only part of the truth. The full story is about a system. Radar detected the enemy at 100 miles. The filter room processed thousands of data points into a single coherent picture. The operations rooms translated that picture into orders. The sector controllers directed the fighters. The pilots did the killing. No single element could have won alone. The genius was in the integration, the connection of every piece into one machine that moved faster than the enemy could react or understand. The Germans lost the Battle of Britain not because their technology was inferior, their radar was better, not because their aircraft were worse. The Messerschmitt 109 was in many respects superior to the Hurricane and equal to the Spitfire, not because their pilots lacked courage or skill. Galland, Molders, and Wick were among the finest fighter pilots who ever lived. The Germans lost because they were fighting a system they could not see, could not comprehend, and could not defeat. They fought the Dowding System and never even learned its name. Today, Bentley Priory is a museum. The filter room has been preserved. The plotting table is still there. The balcony where the tellers stood is still there. Visitors can stand where Dowding stood and look down at the map of southern England, where the fate of the free world was decided by women pushing wooden counters with sticks. The Battle of Britain bunker at Uxbridge, where Churchill asked what reserves remained and Park answered with 3 words, is also open to the public. 60 feet underground, 76 steps down. The original plotting table and tote board are intact. There is no grand memorial to the Dowding System, no towering monument on the White Cliffs, no statue of Watson Watt in Parliament Square. The system that saved Britain was classified when it mattered and overlooked when the danger passed. But the story survives. A meteorologist who tracked thunderstorms for 20 years built a machine that could see across the channel. A stubborn air marshal nobody liked assembled it into the most sophisticated military network on Earth. A 4'11" former upholsterer from Amersham sat at her radar screen while 90 bombs fell on her station and refused to stop calling plots. A 28-year-old physicist briefed the Prime Minister and saved a factory that built the engines that powered the fighters that held the line. A German general flew an airship up the English coast and heard the very thing he was looking for but dismissed it as noise. A Reichsmarschall ordered his pilots to stop destroying the one target that could have won him the battle, and a Scottish inventor, decades later, was pulled over by his own creation on a highway in Canada. The RAF always knew the Germans were coming. Now you know how, but most people do not. Most people have never heard of the Dowding System, the filter room, Avis Hearn, or the Zeppelin mission that failed. That is where you come in. Hit the like button. Not for us, for them, for the women who sat at those screens and were forbidden from telling their own families what they did. For the Air Marshal who saved his country and was fired for it. For the inventor who gave Britain its shield and received £50,000 and a speeding ticket in return. Every like sends this video to someone new. Every share keeps these names from vanishing. Hit subscribe. Turn on notifications. We go through archives, declassified files, and official records to find stories like this one. Stories that sat in government vaults for decades while the world moved on. Drop a comment. Tell us where you are watching from. United Kingdom, United States, Canada, Australia, Germany, New Zealand. We have viewers on every continent. Tell us if someone in your family served during the Battle of Britain, worked at a radar station, or volunteered for the Observer Corps. This comment section is a roll call. Every name matters. Thank you for watching. Thank you for staying until the end. And thank you for making sure that the people who built the invisible shield that saved Britain finally received the recognition their own country denied them.